So I'm really happy to be here. As Peggy said, my name is Laura Packer. I have over 30 years of storytelling experience as a performer, as a teacher, as a coach, and also doing something called organizational storytelling, which is what I'm going to share with you today. Do I sound okay? Does this sound good to you? Great. It's always a little hard to tell for myself. So before I actually dive into the presentation, let me just tell you a little bit about who I am, and hello to everybody watching the Zoom and watching the recording. So I was born in Philadelphia. My mother was a children's librarian and my father was an aspiring writer. So I grew up surrounded by stories. My mom would share with me the folk tales that she was learning to tell the kids in her library. And my dad, he would tell me stories from the radio shows that he remembered from his youth, like the Green Hornet, the Shadow. Does anyone know what those are? Does that ring some bells? So if you don't know, these were radio dramas that were on before there was television, and the Shadow was a hero who was always trying to take down villains. And the theme line, the tagline to the Shadow was, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows." So I was the only 5-year-old in Philadelphia in the early 70s running around saying that. I grew up, I went to college, I went to Boston University, where I got a degree in folklore and mythology, which means my degree is basically in fairy tales. I have a degree in fairy tales and myths and things like that. And while I was there, I met a storyteller named Brother Blue, who in fact was married to Ruth Hill, whom I just mentioned in my Happy Bucks, and he took me under his wing. Now, Brother Blue was an internationally known figure. He was an officer in World War II. He got his bachelor's at Harvard, his master's at Yale, and his doctorate at Harvard. And then he set all of that aside to tell stories on the streets and in prisons and for the United Nations, wherever he could, he shared stories. And so from a very young age with my parents, and then in my late adolescence and early 20s, it was brought into me how important stories. And that is what I'm here to talk to you about today. I lived in Boston for a long time. I moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and now I'm here. I moved here for love, because everyone always asks why I came to Minnesota. When I moved to Kansas City with my first husband who died, and then I fell in love with someone who lives up here. So that's why I'm here. So that's a little bit about me. So let me talk to you about storytelling. We're going to work on. There we go. So what is storytelling? Well, when people hear the word storytelling, they think of this. They think of telling stories to little kids, or they think of performing on stage, like with the moth, telling a personal story. And those are both aspects of storytelling. But storytelling is actually all of these things as well. Storytelling is simply how humans communicate. We share stories with one another. It's in fact hardwired into our brains. So I'm going to share a little bit about how our brains think about stories, how our brains use stories, because I think this is a useful thing to know when you're thinking about using stories in professional settings, in organizational settings. So during the first Gulf War, the military noticed that there were some people who were much better at developing relationships with leaders in small, mic just cut out. All righty. Who realized that there were people, I hope the Zoom is still recording this, we'll find out, who realized that there were people who were much better at developing relationships than others in villages and wherever they might be. And they realized that the reason that some people were better than others, even though they all had the same resources and the same things to offer, was because some of them listened better and told stories. Things like a leader might have a grandchild running around, and the soldier who's there to try and build that relationship says, "Oh, is that your granddaughter? My daughter's the same age. Let me show you her picture. Let me tell you a story about her." So people began to develop relationships. And the military needed to know why it worked, as the military is, because the military always needs to know why things work. So they started a bunch of experiments to find out how our brains process information and process narrative. If you find this boring, I promise, give me 2 minutes and we'll move on. I find it fascinating. So they put people into an MRI machine and they showed them videos, they had them listen to stories, and they had them read. And what they found was that the brain was far more engaged when they heard stories, and they could tell how the brain was engaged by looking at where the blood goes in the brain. That tells you what parts of your brain you're using. So what they discovered is that when you hear a story, you remember it as if it happened to you. It's encoded in your brain as if it was actually an experience. So stories are great for education. Something called neural coupling happens. So if I were to tell you a story and describe an experience like running from zombies, and if I described it really well about how I was running and I could feel my heart pounding and my breath was tearing in my throat, and I turned around and the zombies were right behind me. So if I told it really well, my brain would actually think that I was running. And what's more, your brain would think the same thing. We remember stories as if they are memories and as if we actually did the stuff that the story is about. There's also something called brain mirroring, which means if you look at a picture of my brain at a certain moment in a story and look at a picture of your brain at the same moment, the blood flow to different parts of our brains is nearly identical. It's like our brains are mirroring each other. Storytelling is the only thing that this happens with. So storytelling is as close to telepathy as we have, because our brains are in exactly the same place at the same time. The hormones related to relationship building and related to empathy and compassion are sky high when we hear stories. And both the left and right hemispheres, you can come on in if you're coming to fix this. Okay, come on in. I'll just stand over here. The left and right hemispheres of our brains are deeply engaged. So we use our whole brains when we're hearing stories, which is not something that happens frequently. Those of you who might be in education, well, you know that whole brain engagement is a big deal. We learn better when our whole brains are engaged. So storytelling leads to whole brain engagement, which helps us remember and learn and build relationships faster. What this means is that storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool for building relationships and for persuasion. For example, getting people to join Rotary or give $20 for a ticket. If you can include a story with that, people are much more likely to do it. So what is storytelling? Well, at its most basic, storytelling means you're sharing stories and you're listening to someone else's narrative experience. But what storytelling really is fundamentally human. Other animals do all the things we do. They grieve, they play, they do all kinds of things. They use tools, but to our knowledge, no other animals tell stories. Yeah? Great, thank you. Was it batteries or did I push a button? Okay, great, thank you. So storytelling is fundamentally human. It is arguably our oldest art form. That's why our brains are so wired for story, because we've been telling stories for 10,000 years. Whereas we've been watching videos for 100, our brains haven't had a chance to catch up. Now I say arguably our oldest art form because dance is also an ancient art form, but with stories, because we learn so well through stories, if an early human went out and had to escape a saber-toothed tiger or something like that, they would come back and tell the story about what happened. And then that story would be told again and again and again, which is where myths come from telling those stories over and over. Storytelling fosters connections and relationships. It's a path to empathy, and it helps break down barriers. So for example, one of my neighbors has very different politics from mine. I fly flags that say one thing, he flies flags that say another thing, but we talk over our back fences and we tell each other stories about our gardens. And in the media, you would believe that we'd be throwing rocks at each other. But because we tell stories, our political differences aren't quite as important anymore. Storytelling builds community, which is what Rotary is all about building community, about service, about helping people. So it's a highway to learning, persuasion, and engagement. So what makes a good story? I have till 1:15, right? Yeah, okay. So what makes a good story? Well, a good story is authentic to you. So if you're trying to sell somebody a lottery ticket to Rotary, you'll tell them about Rotary, but you'll also tell them why you care about Rotary. So it's an authentic story to you, not just saying Rotary was founded here. It's appropriate. If I'd come here and said, once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a house at the edge of the woods with her mommy, that's not appropriate. You tell stories that are appropriate for the audience in front of you. I was going to tell you Red Riding Hood, in case anyone was wondering. Stories are sincerely shared. Now, I do this all the time. I talk about stories, I tell stories all the time, but I work hard to make sure that I want to do what I'm doing, want to share this information. So I'm sharing it sincerely so it connects more deeply with the people who are listening. And yeah, you have stories, even if you think you don't, because everyone does, because we are human. Stories in this context don't have to be beautifully told. I'm not talking about being up on a stage. I'm just talking about sharing a story with the person in front of you. So there are lots of different kinds of stories. There's casual storytelling, which we all do every day. There's performance storytelling, getting up on stage. There are presentations like what I'm doing now. And there's organizational storytelling, along with many others. Today, what I'm talking about from this point on is organizational storytelling. So what is it? Well, if we accept that humans are storytelling creatures, that we evolved to tell stories, and that our organizations reflect who we are, then storytelling has a place in organizations. So what does that mean? Organizational storytelling are the stories told in and about an organization. Every organization has stories, and those stories are generated by everyone. Every single one of you has some kind of story about Rotary. It could be how you came here. It could be about how it changed your life, or a time when you saw it change someone else's life. How those stories are told and to whom you're telling them has an impact. Again, that goes back to appropriate stories. And I should have mentioned earlier, you're going to get a copy of these slides. You get a PDF of these slides. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. So don't worry if you can't remember everything. So anyway, storytelling in organizations can help you with all kinds of things. Now, I'm not going to read this list to you. But while you're looking at the slide, I will give you a tiny little pitch because this is a good moment to do so. I brought a bunch of stuff that you can buy. However, I'm also going to do a raffle for some of this, for a copy of a booklet, How to Tell a Great Story, and a booklet on the 5 critical organizational stories, what I'm talking about today. If you want to sign up for that raffle, there's a mailing list right there. Brian, would you mind starting that? Put your name down. I would really like it if you also gave me your email address, because of course I want to be able to send you emails. But I promise it's infrequent. I will never share your email, and I hate spam, so I try and make it useful. So if you're willing to put down your email address, I'd really appreciate it. If not, that's okay too. Put down your name. You're still part of the raffle. Onward. So organizational storytelling actually helps the organization be more human, because it's about everything that stories can produce. Those stories that an organization tells need to be audience focused and connected. So you've probably seen an advertisement at some point on television or on your phone that made you cry. That is a really well told short story that's audience focused and connected. They knew who you were. They knew how to target you in that ad, in that story. They should be authentic. Organizational stories, just like stories individuals tell, should be authentic to the organization. Organizational storytelling can empower everyone in the organization to have a voice. If you were to have gone to NASA in the 1960s and asked anybody there why they were there, why they were doing their job, whether it was an engineer or a secretary or a janitor, everyone in the organization would have said, "We are here to put a man on the moon." They all felt empowered to tell that story because it was being told so well to them. So organizational storytelling helps everyone in that organization feel like they have a voice. Organizational stories need to have emotional hooks, because if you're just giving facts and figures, no one gets emotional. It is emotion that drives people to action. If you want someone to donate, if you want someone to do something for you, make them feel something. So if you combine data and a little story, people are much more likely to do what you want, and that's a facet of organizational storytelling. Organizational storytelling helps the organization have a more connected and rich culture. And again, data and story, I jumped ahead. Rearrange the slide next time I do it. But if you combine the two, you have a very powerful tool because stories add value that facts alone cannot convey. So for example, when I have more time to do a similar presentation, I include a slide that has a whole bunch of facts about cancer. Cancer is the #2 killer in the United States. It costs billions of dollars a year. There's a lot of research being done for new understandings of cancer, facts about cancer. But then when I say, when I was 45 years old, my first husband died from pancreatic cancer. He survived 69 days from his diagnosis. When I was 26, I had cancer, and I had cancer that's recurrent. So for the rest of my life, every few years, I need to get checked to see if I too am going to die from cancer. Now, when I tell you that tiny story, that probably made some of you feel something. And I would be willing to bet that it made all of you think about someone you know who has had cancer, maybe even yourselves. So if you pair those facts and that story, people are much more likely to act. So when you're selling your raffle ticket, say $20 helps make Golden Valley a better place. Here are some of the projects we did before. Here's a person whom we helped. It'll make people much more likely to act in the way you want them to. So what kinds of stories work in organizations? Well, personal experience stories out of your life are always good. Historical stories can be very effective. You can talk about, if the organization is struggling, you can talk about another story of struggle, a historical story of struggle, for example. Traditional stories can work in organizations if it's the right story at the right time. There's a story from India about 3 blind men in a village who encounter an elephant, and they're great friends. They walk up to the elephant, which they've never met an elephant before, and one of them feels the trunk and says, "Oh, an elephant is like a vine." The next blind man feels the elephant's side and says, "Oh, an elephant's like a wall." And the third blind man feels the elephant's tail and says, "An elephant is like a rope." They're all right, but none of them are right. I'm willing to bet there have been times in your life when you have been with people, each of whom had a different opinion, and everyone was right, but none of them was right. So if you tell a traditional story, sometimes it helps people break out of the rut that they're in, break out of that frozen place. But personally, I love the 5 critical organizational stories for organizational storytelling. These are the history of the organization, the mission, vision, and values of the organization in action. So stories that say you did what you said you were going to do, stories of success and failure, personal commitment, why you're here, and manifesto, the stories that are looking to the future. We plan to do these things. So in a little more detail, the historical and foundational stories are the founding of the organization, how it started, who were the people who founded it, and what was the problem that they were trying to address when they launched that organization. Almost every organization starts because of some kind of problem or question, so knowing that can be really helpful. The mission, vision, and values in action, specific examples of doing what you said you would do, times when the organization helped someone, times when the organization realized it needed to pivot and do things differently to remain true to the values. People and results stories, success and failure stories. These are stories about specific individuals who did something really, really good. Success stories should be about individuals. It could be about you. It could be about someone else. Failure stories are usually stories about the organization. We as an organization missed this opportunity, and this is what we're going to do going forward. So it's a way of talking about how you've learned and grown and changed. Your personal commitment story, why you care, can be very powerful. Some years ago, I was doing a workshop with a large pharmaceutical company with their marketing team. And I was having people come up with a story for each of the 5 critical stories. When we got to the personal commitment story, what I said is, why do you come into work every day? And most of the people went, oh, because they all had a reason to come in. There was one woman who throughout the whole thing had been sitting there with her arms crossed and a scowl on her face. And she raised her hand and said, I come here because I get a paycheck. And I said, okay, that's a good reason. What does that paycheck get you? Who does the paycheck support? And then I broke them up into small groups and had everyone think about why they were there, tell the stories of why they were there. A few minutes later, I saw that woman with her head in her hands sobbing and everyone leaning towards her. And I thought, uh-oh, what have I done? So I went over to check and she lifted up her face and she said to me, my son is alive because of a medication this company makes. That's why I come to work every day. So we all have some reason to do what we do. It may just take a little while to get there. Finally, the manifesto story is the future-looking story. What do you hope to do with this organization in the future? Where do you want to see it go? What do you plan to do? Or what does the organization say it's going to do? We all need to be able to talk about the future, and telling that story can be very powerful. So I have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to run through this quickly. I'd like you to take just a moment and think about the history or foundational story of Rotary. How was it founded? What was that launching problem? Who were the founders? So think about it for just a moment. Or other significant events, I'm sorry. So you have that story in your mind. Think about how you would tell that story to someone, highlighting the things that you care about in that story. So what does it mean to you? How does it apply to you in the organization? And what is the crucial moment in this story for you? Why does this story matter to you? How are you changed by the organization or by knowing about the foundations, the organization? And who are you now, as opposed to when you first came to the organization? And then you'll think about who your next audience is, who you might tell that story to next. Somebody to whom you're selling a raffle ticket, someone that you're asking to sponsor an event, a potential new member. So think about why you're telling it to them. What's the point in sharing this story with them? What do you want them to do in response to that story? And what is important to them? Your best guess, of course. So you'll shape that story with the audience in mind. There's always the story as it matters to you. And then there's the story that you share with someone else. And if it's an organizational story, it's because you want them to do something or feel something or respond in a certain way. So you have to think about who they are and what you think will help move them in the direction you want them to go. So how can you be a better storyteller? Tell stories that you're interested in, that are authentic to you. Have some idea of who your audience is and try and tell stories that are appropriate to that audience. When you mess up, try it again, because you will mess up. I've been doing this for 30 years. I cannot tell you how many mistakes I've made. I make new mistakes certainly every month, if not every day. And then you try again and try and learn from it. Try and enjoy it while you're doing it. Practice. Practice really matters. So you can practice on your own, or you can practice with other people. And if you practice with someone else, say to them, hey, I want to tell this story, but I need you to just listen to me. And when I'm done, tell me what you like. Because we all have really good critics in our head that will tell us all the things we did wrong. Hearing the things that actually worked gives you something to build upon. And not being interrupted is important too, so you have a chance to get the story out the way you want to tell it. So there's this old joke. There's a guy walking down the street in New York City, and he's just minding his own business when this other fellow runs up to him, sweating and panting, desperately trying to catch his breath, and he's clutching a violin case. And this guy who just ran up says, can you tell me, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? You know, that big performance venue? And the fellow who had been minding his own business just looked at him and said, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. So if you want to get better at this, you got to practice. You need to listen to other storytellers, notice what you like about what they're saying, and get listened to yourself. Use your stories. Notice what works. Think about what you might want to change. Ask other people for their stories, because that might inspire more stories for you. Attend coaching, get coached, do workshops and trainings. Yes, I do that. I'm not trying to sell you on it, but these services exist broadly. They exist broadly. I have stuff for sale. Could someone pass me the mailing list, please, so I can pick the winner? All right, excellent. Drum roll, please. Hey Siri, give me a random number between 1 and 7. She's thinking. She's having trouble with the connection. Okay. Did everybody put their name down? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. Then since Siri's not helping me. Tim Klesk? Okay. All right. Would somebody take this for him? Great. I'm sorry that it wasn't here. Thank you. So that's what I have to say. When you get the slides, you'll be able to contact me. Thank you so much for your time today. And I really hope that this was useful. And if I can be of service, get in touch.